Welcome to these very auspicious, experienced, and respected supply chain practitioners and thought leaders. It really is a privilege to have you on this discussion around agility and where supply chain is going. Given the backdrop of the pandemic and COVID-19, healthcare is obviously fundamentally under challenge in terms of its responsiveness. The way we're thinking about supply chain's patient back, the fact that supply chain has emerged to being a really critical part of the business strategy, whereas perhaps previously it was more about cost and quality and efficiency of getting products to customers. The idea that we start with the patient and work our way back. And then I think there's a resurgence in the idea and the understanding of agility. We haven't heard agility for a couple of years, and no question about what agility has cost us in our supply chains, not being able to respond in a resilient way to the challenges that all countries have faced in the pandemic scenario. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves, to give a little bit of background on themselves, and also to make a statement to start the ball rolling. So, Professor Hau Lee, let's start off with you.
Well, thanks so much, Roddy, and it's really my privilege and honor to be part of this very stellar professional team. I am a professor at Stanford University in the Graduate School of Business, and I have been studying and researching, helping companies on how to improve supply chain for a long, long time. And it's very exciting to see, exciting in a sense of the uplifting of the profession. Of course, I think we're not happy with the pandemic. We all are really concerned about the situation. But really, supply chain has become at the center of the attention, that because we are the one who try to help to bring the most urgent needs being met. And this is the glue, especially in the healthcare and the pharmaceutical area, where, for instance, like plasma, which is, I've been advising a company called Cloud Leaf in helping visibility. And they are working with plasma companies to try to ensure that the right product in the right state and the best state is shipped to the right demand point in the most timely fashion. So this is agility. Agility has become even more important than before after the Japan earthquake, after our the need for flu shots and being a surge. This time is a much bigger one. And I am using the term that you cannot just have agility. You need super agility, or in the cloud computing world, they use the term hyperscaler, which is hyper agility. So the elevating the speed and the flexibility and the responsiveness is one level up, and eventually you need hyper agility. And that's required fundamentally a very, very powerful visibility network, because without visibility, you cannot have agility. And visibility requires us to have both end-to-end visibility, understanding not just where things are, but also the state and the condition of the product, as well as some of the soft attributes, like has the signature been done, or has some approval been obtained. And so these are soft attributes, and all of those combined together, then you need your good sense of making intelligence out of it. So I call it smart sensing, sensitive sensing, actionable sensing. And then together that forms visibility being actionable and responsible. And that is how I think the healthcare and the pharmaceutical world must migrate to, so that we have hyper agility.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Professor. And actually, couldn't be a better tee-in for you, Paul, as the leader of a healthcare plasma company, to talk about what are the impact of agility on your own leading change in your own operations.
Well, Roddy, thanks again for the invitation. This is great to get this crew of individuals together who are really, a privilege and an honor to lead many people in supply chains around the world. And I can't agree more with Professor Lee's idea of hyper agility. But before I start, I just wanted to give a shout out to all those essential employees, not just at my company at CSL Plasma, but all essential employees around the world who are doing things day in and day out, whether it's at hospitals, plasma donation centers like I'm at now, the front lines in a manufacturing plant. You know, they really deserve a lot of credit to make this conversation around supply chain even happen. So my thanks to everyone around the globe who is essential in really driving the day-to-day for the rest of the world to benefit from. You know, from that hyper agility comment, I really think this pandemic, and when you think about the transparency that Professor Lee commented on, the hyper agility, this has really tested all facets of the business to a point where every individual facet of the business has had to tap into its business continuity plans, its what if thinking. You know, the hurricanes and other things that have occurred over the years, although devastating, certainly only flexed one muscle. You know, how could you do logistics or how could you do supply differently for many companies like ours? But now, in terms of this pandemic, every muscle across our supply chain has to be flexed, and has to be flexed in a completely different way, and has to be flexed in concert with all the other flexing going on along the pipe, right? We're a people-to-people business in plasma, from donors who are willing to come in and donate to the patient at the end receiving the life-saving medicine. And every facet of that supply chain, from the donor, through manufacturing plants, through logistics and distribution, have had to pull in business continuity plans at a pace that I've never seen before. So shout out, one, that every supply chain needs a good business continuity plan. I also think it will help us as we move forward to make sure that we have those continuity plans in place. They do cost a little extra money, right, to make sure that you can pull lever A or lever B when you need it. But the ability to do that in real time and to do that synced across your end-to-end supply chain is important. And the second additional comment I'd like to make is, you know, when you're a global company on an event like this, you have to follow the globe and you have to learn and constantly adjust. You know, for me, this actually started in late December, early January, because we have a plant right in Wuhan, China. So we've been learning from that plant and constantly following this pandemic as it moved from Asia to Europe into the United States, and in every case, learning along the way. So that's where it's important as a global company to act locally, but think globally. And you have to use that global thinking and that local experience to educate yourself, particularly in an event like this, to move forward. So that'd be my initial thoughts, Roddy.
Fantastic, Paul. Thank you very much. As leader of CSL, it's a privilege, together with the rest of the panelists, to have you. So let's go to Mike Wittman. Mike, you know your experience with consumer at J&J and Mars. I mean, I know Mike as strong right in the heart of the engine room, figuring out how we're going to go forward. So introduce yourself, a little bit of your background, and we look forward to hearing your perspective.
All righty. Thanks for letting me join such an august group. It's awesome to be a part of this event. So my background, I have 40 years of supply chain experience, literally from top to bottom and side to side, starting off as a shop floor operator right out of high school, making Tylenol on midnight shifts, and ultimately finishing up as chief supply chain officer in the food industry for Pinnacle Foods. I spent about 30 years of my career with Johnson & Johnson, and the last 10 in the food industry with Mars Chocolate and ultimately with Pinnacle Foods. And my background spans the full breadth of plan, source, make, deliver, IT, finance, and really has given me a really broad approach to solving business problems. But, you know, as turn it over to the other folks on this call quickly, my thought is as we attack agility, two quick thoughts. I think agility in the pharmaceutical industry in particular, as part of the focus of this event, but in general, is a massive leap forward. It cannot be underestimated. The market circumstances in pharmaceuticals, the long product development lead times, the long regulatory approval lead times, have long allowed the manufacturers and marketers of drugs to, quite frankly, be a little complacent and slow to react. And the COVID-19 crisis has just put everything on overdrive. So I think being extremely intentional about the focus on agility today and looking at all dimensions is going to be absolutely critical. The other comment I have, an initial thought, and we'll talk about this a little bit later when we talk about how to get started, is that you cannot jump into agility and focus on agility and the sensing or visibility that Dr. Lee talks about without having a solid foundation around reliability. And, you know, because if you've ever implemented SAP, which many of you have in the audience, you know that just going in and automating the information flows and making them real time can create a lot more problems than it does solutions. And without an underlying reliable supply chain in end-to-end execution, not just in the supply chain, but also in demand sensing and demand visibility and forecasting, et cetera, and product development and the robustness of the processes for that product development. Without that core reliability, launching on an agility focus will do nothing but amplify the failures upstream in reliability. So that's not to say that they have to come in succession, but you can't focus on agility without also focusing on reliability.
That's a fantastic point. And Mike, thank you for that. And I think you drive home, and it's a really great tee-in for Paul Bittinger, you know, who led a lot of the continuous improvement and the agile operations at P&G. But you make an excellent point, and that is, if you simply focus on connection of systems, you land up with what Professor Hau Lee talks about, all these, you spend billions of dollars on searchlights, but stuff goes and hides in the dark places, and that really destructs the business and disrupts the business. So, Paul, how does, you know, P&G, great organization, really get agility? I've been talking and building agility for as long as I've worked with P&G for the last 15 years. Talk a little bit about your background and something you'd like to start the ball rolling.
Yeah, well, I spent 31 years with P&G, and very much like Mike, I started as a shift team manager and eventually ended up running the supply network operations for the health sector in P&G. And then my last assignment there, I was focusing on the supply chain of the future. What would the supply chain look like 10 years from that point? And right before I left, we had started up 10 different test models in 10 different categories in 10 different countries to really start understanding touchless supply chains. But I'll really emphasize what Mike said: without reliability, without predictability within your supply chain, then a lot of your visibility and a lot of your planning and a lot of your systems look like they're not working, but what's really not working is reliability and predictability of what's happening. And I think one of the biggest killers of predictability in supply chain, or at least in planning, is trying to have a supply chain that can cover any and every possible outrageous scenario in the world. So, you know, I think COVID has taught us that ever so often it's just going to be every country, everywhere, and hopefully not very often. But I'm not sure how you plan a supply chain or design a supply chain for a once-in-a-lifetime event. And I think that's a misnomer, because I think a lot of business people believe they can create a risk-free supply chain if they can just get agile. And what agility really speaks to is really making that 85–90% of the supply chain that just happens every day. I'm not talking about the 5, 10, 15% exceptions or unusual events, but using agility to really drive reliability, drive service, and certainly drive cost in that supply chain on a day-to-day basis, and then having the other systems in place to really understand when you're getting off the rails and what scenario are you starting to go into when disruption happens, whatever that disruption might be. The only other area I wanted to touch on a little bit later in this call is really emphasize the people part of it. And I'm going to use the word collaboration later. I think what we're all seeing in COVID right now is you can give everybody the same data. And if you have 3 people looking at the same screen with the exact same news story, you're going to have 3 completely different interpretations of what the data is saying, what we should do next, what their risks are, what their contributions could be, etc. So as we get into the call later, I do want to talk quite a bit about what collaboration looks like in the supply chain, ensuring that as everybody has end-to-end visibility, everybody also has an understanding of who owns what, when, where, why, and what are we going to do about what we're seeing on the computer screen in front of us as a complete supply chain and not as individuals responding to the data in their own silo or in their own perspective.
And I think that's something that's going to be close, near and dear to Paul McKenzie's heart, because that's certainly in a leadership role that's critical. You know, the one comment I can't help but make, and that is, you know, no matter how good your visibility of chaos is, it doesn't make it any less chaotic. In fact, it probably makes it more chaotic. So, you know, that's the reality. So thank you very much, Paul. And so let's kick in straight away into the first question. And, you know, I've affectionately dubbed Professor Hau Lee as the father of agility here because of his bullwhip, and I know he doesn't have his bullwhip with him. But I've asked him just to talk a little around some agility nuggets. You know, help us understand, what does agility really mean? People are reading about it. There's a ton of articles, webinars, agility. Put it in plain, simple students' language, Professor.
Well, thanks very much, Roddy. And it was always great to listen to all these other colleagues, professional colleagues, and I learned from them as well. So thank you, Paul and Mike. Agility, in a very simple term, is really a combination of good sensing and being able to respond well. And if I repeat what Mike and Paul talk about, it's really about sensing. It's a visibility foundation. Sensing is not easy because of the unreliability of data, incompleteness of the data, or sometimes the distortion of the data. That, Roddy, you reminded me of the term bullwhip, which I wrote about a long time ago. And the bullwhip is because there are all kinds of distortion in the supply chain. The piece of information that you have at your fingertip may not be reality because it has passed through multiple hands. And I think Paul also mentioned about the multiple companies that you need to collaborate. And mainly because if you don't have the right collaboration and the right incentives, information also could be distorted. So sensing is not easy. You have to make sense out of the sense. You have a lot of information. How can you make sense out of the sense that you have? So that's the first element. So the first, visibility, sensing, but smart sensing, sensible sensing. And then you have to respond, because sensing without action is not actionable sensing. It's not actionable visibility. Is also no good. And how can we respond? And it requires the speed and the flexibility and now the collaboration, because you cannot single-handedly do it. In the plasma case, you need every piece of the supply chain, every element, logistics partners and the cold chain partners, and everyone to be able to respond in a synchronized fashion. And so that's the response part. And so I always said, it's jokingly, I say, well, sense and respond is what agility is, but super agility, hyper agility means that you need sensible sense, making sense out of sense, and you need responsive response, so that when you respond, you really respond fast. And that is my simple way of describing what agility is about, Roddy.
And I think you make the point that, you know, agility is about people, process, and technology. You can't build agility in a people sense or in a technology sense or in a process sense. That hyper agility, that hyper sensing, that hyper speed and responsiveness means that people have to work with enabling technology, with the right processes, and do the right things. Otherwise, the impact of the disruption doesn't go away. It, in fact, gets worse. So, Paul, you've as COO, you've obviously, you know, in a role where you lead from the top down building of agility in a mission critical business, given that it's plasma. What sort of challenges and what sort of recommendations, perspectives would you give on leading that level of fundamental change in a business from a COO level?
Well, the good news is I can just steal with pride from everything that's been said from my colleagues here, right? So, you know, the way we bring this to life is what we call a reliability room. And actually, Mike will remember we had reliability rooms at Johnson & Johnson, and I stole with pride after I left Johnson & Johnson. And they really focus in on everything that the other speakers have talked about. they focus in on this idea of visibility, but they focus in on this idea, how do you look for smoke signals, which I would say Professor Lee's referring to as sensing, right? How do you look at those smoke signals? How do you then collaborate around the smoke signal? Because to Paul's point, I may look at a smoke signal and say, not a big deal. Mike may look at it and go, oh my God, it's going to burn down the house. And you need to get to a point where people, one, recognize the smoke signal, two, get rewarded for raising the smoke signal, because oftentimes you teach people to stamp out the smoke signal and distort the data to Professor Lee's viewpoint, where in fact you want them to really raise their hand and say, hey, I got a smoke signal here and I've seen it more than once. And then you really got to drive that simulation and collaboration around that smoke signal to get to one view, and it's a dynamic view of the state of the business at that given point. So I think the themes that our colleagues have talked about here around sensing, collaboration, reliability room, I think you bring them together in what we call virtual reliability room. And I ask every function to check their hat at the door and really just come in as a patient. Come in as a person that has to rely on that medicine day in and day out, and think about, if you were that patient, would that smoke signal concern you? And how would you want that, as a patient, the organization to respond? And it's actually interesting because as you get people to take off their functional hats, I think they collaborate better. I think they think differently. And I think they keep, Roddy, what you've been pushing, the patient front and center as they raise their hand around these smoke signals and work the business to address them. So that patient centricity and that focus, non-functional agnostic focus, is really what we've been trying to drive through our reliability room effort.
And Paul, if I can just share a little nugget, based on the way you operate at CSL, and I think for me it's a best practice, the fact that you attend reliability meetings, right? So at the end of the day, every manufacturing site, every company has issues that disrupt the supply chain. And virtually every plant, every 24 hours, looks at those issues and says, where are the smoke signals, if there are any? And the fact that the top leadership, the COO, has visibility of that meeting, attends that meeting, and can keep his or her finger on the pulse of the business, I think is absolutely a best practice. This is not a technology-driven meeting. It's not a continuous improvement-driven meeting. It's really keeping your finger on the pulse of the business on a 24 by 24 basis to see where are those smoke signals and, how serious are they? So that's a fantastic best practice, and certainly one that I would accredit to you and at CSL. So thank you very much for that. Paul, Mike, if we can go to you, in the depths of a manufacturing operation, I mean, talking about your experience, you've grown up from inside operations, you've grown all the way up to leading and managing a big global supply chain in many companies. Where do you start? Because this is kind of daunting. If I walked into a company and I said, all right, we're going to start agility tomorrow, what the hell does that mean? And where do you start doing that?
Yeah, it's a great question, Roddy. As most of us do, we learn more from our mistakes throughout our careers than we do from our successes. And Paul will probably remember this. If I go back to my J&J time, I was responsible for leading what we called process excellence, but it was basically our kind of Lean Six Sigma business process focus within Johnson & Johnson. So I had the responsibility for the global consumer part of the organization and partnered with the pharma and med device groups to develop the approach. And it was tremendously successful, I believe, in lots of ways. Certainly made me into a much better supply chain professional. But as we started the program, we started developing the tools and techniques for problem solving, Six Sigma, Lean, and design for Six Sigma in particular. And what we learned as we started going through that is we had put the cart ahead of the horse. What we had failed to do was establish the ultimate goal, which was what are the measures of success? And then how do you apply those tools to then improve the measures of success? So when we really hit our stride was when we took a step back and started focusing on a fourth leg of the stool or dimension around dashboarding. and dashboarding all the key metrics from the top down, from the CEO on down, and mapping those metrics. And I'm a huge believer in managing with metrics as leaders. It gives you a very objective evaluation of your performance. You can use the metrics to hold people accountable, not only functionally, but importantly, cross-functionally, to start to drive the collaboration that both Pauls have talked about, and the focus for the organization. So I think for me, the key is to determine how are you gonna, what is the right metric? How are you gonna focus the business on the metrics that will be most important to the business? We're all in business to make money. Financial metrics have existed, for millennia. But as we think about supply chain, what are the critical metrics there that are going to make us more agile? And I believe there's kind of really two that focus on this agility concept. Number one is something that Paul Bittinger and team really kind of pioneered at Procter Gamble, that's taken hold in the consumer market, is this idea of service as measured by the customer. And in the consumer businesses, J&J at Mars and at Pinnacle, and all three businesses, we focused on a measure called OTIF, on time and in full, as the ultimate measure, but as seen through the customer's eyes, right? So each customer will measure on time or in full differently. For example, one customer will have a 24-hour delivery window. Another customer may have a 2-hour delivery window. And we need to know how they see our performance against each of those standards. Because for the one that has a 2-hour window, if we hit it within 24 hours, because that's the way we've defined success in our eyes, we're failing in their eyes. So we lose the transparency that Dr. Lee speaks to, right? So the idea of creating a success measure and ultimately being patient-centered. What is the patient looking for? They're looking for having their medication on time, in the right quantities, in the right quality and efficacy, and they need it where they want it delivered. So that really is, the best measure we have is something like this concept of on time and full. So starting at the patient, but also working your way back throughout the supply chain, from the patient back to the doctor or the pharmacy or the clinic that's providing that, from the clinic back to the distribution point for the manufacturing and marketing company, from the distribution point back to manufacturing, upstream to suppliers, and ultimately to suppliers of suppliers, and understanding really that the performance, that reliable performance and flow along the supply chain, being able to look at each step along the way and understanding, am I delivering what is needed, where it is needed, when it is needed by the person downstream or ultimately the patient, and then starting to focus on the cycle time, the response time. As I start to see smoke signals, there are going to be smoke signals happen, right? When we were doing some of the Six Sigma work at J&J, I took a look at my own supply chain when I started running the consumer products business supply chain. And we looked at, it was a fairly small factory and co-manufacturing network. And we just started calculating what are the possible opportunities for failure through a Six Sigma lens. And when you look at every piece of equipment, every bearing, every raw material, every transaction in a system, et cetera, in a fairly small manufacturing environment, we identified over 500,000 potential failures on a daily basis, right? So your ability to track the flow through the supply chain and measure both reliability and speed of performance is absolutely critical. So by measuring reliability in terms of, am I getting my customer downstream and ultimately the patient what's needed when it's needed, and then how long is it taking me to do that? And then sensing for the smoke signals. When Paul talks to smoke signals, he's talking about failures. Now, a smoke signal can be a potential failure, and you have to constantly be evaluating the magnitude of that failure. But what people don't understand as well is if you can measure your reliability throughout the supply chain, a failure upstream at a supplier, while it's already occurred, so it's by nature a lagging indicator for the supplier, it still can become a leading indicator for the patient, because you've got the lead time for the product to flow through the process and get downstream. So even looking at failures upstream can be leading indicators of potential failures downstream, or smoke signals, as Paul describes. And then you can focus a cross-functional team on how to get rid of those, how to prevent that smoke or that spark from turning into a fire for the end patient or for the end customer. And so as we think about that, I go all the way back to my experience in the 80s, quality circles. And it's a concept I've always embraced as, you know, we build our management techniques over time through our experiences, is this idea of always having both a corrective and a preventive kind of approach. As I'm sensing the data, looking at these opportunities, these potential failures along the supply chain, looking at it through one lens, which is how do I need to correct the specific situation? And what do I do to prevent that particular smoke signal and spark from turning into a fire for a patient? And bringing people together in a very rapid response to that. And that's done through things like reliability rooms that Paul referred to, where people are coming together on a continuous basis, daily and weekly, to sense these signals, take their functional hats off, and everybody attack the problem through the patient's, you know, with the patient's best interest at heart, and prevent that particular event from happening. But then secondly, recognizing that with 500,000 to 1 million failure points on a daily basis, we need to systemically understand those failures. And you do that through your performance management and measurement system, and starting to categorize the failures, whether it's an OTIF failure or whether it's a lack of the inability to hit a cycle time that you've set a goal for in your supply chain and response time. It could be an OEE performance on a manufacturing floor, or it could be a late truck delivery to a customer or to the back door from a supplier. Whatever those events are that you need to be measuring robustly in your performance management system and throughout the end-to-end supply chain, being able to take those and categorize them into buckets in terms of where, when, and most importantly, why failures occur. IT systems will often give you the where, the when, and they also give you the what the specific failure was. But it normally requires today, hopefully AI will start to get us there in the future, but the why requires intervention by human beings to be able to look at the vast complexity of a supply chain and really determine the root cause of why a failure occurred. What was the process issue? And I encourage people to look at the process failure. Too many times we chalk it up to a human error. But the question then is, how do you go deeper? What's the root cause? What's the causal factor below that? What allowed the human to make an error? Is there an opportunity for automation? Is there an opportunity to make the human part of the process more robust through retraining, et cetera? But to be able to
So that's a fantastic.
To be able to systemically look at preventive actions on a categorical basis to drive long-term improvement in the supply chain while also responding to the upstream smoke signals in a corrective fashion.
Great, and there couldn't be a better lead-in for you, Paul, because the couple of things that I always associate with P&G was galvanizing the whole supply chain transformation, the consumer-driven supply network around the moment of truth. What is the moment of truth? When the patient or the shopper needs the product, it's got to be on the shelf. And the whole business is driven by that shelf availability. So talk a little around the people, process, technology. How was it that P&G got it all together? In other words, when I used to attend meetings at P&G, it was never an IT point of view or a people point of view or process. It was all of the above, and every project was measured in NOS terms, not in technology success terms or people terms. So Paul, share a little bit of the magic sauce with us.
Well, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to fully describe the magic sauce because, as everybody has already discussed, it's complicated and it's hard work. And you asked a question a minute ago on where do you start? And I think one of the first questions I've always asked is, have we documented who is doing what and why? And if we haven't documented that, then let's start documenting that, because you're not going to automate something. You're not going to be able to collaborate. You're not going to be able to work processes without understanding what the actual work is. And once you've documented that work, then you can start all the continuous improvement. You can start working the interconnections, et cetera. But to your point, Roddy, I think for P&G, two key factors played into it. And you already named one, and that's there's only 2 moments of truth. Whatever's going on in this meeting is not a moment of truth. The 2 moments of truth are, is it on the shelf? And what's that initial consumer experience using the product? And if those two are the only 2 things that are true, everything else is just trying to make those things happen correctly and continuously improve against them. But for us, a big piece of process management was the acknowledgement and the recognition that In a supply chain, and I'm going to use kind of a silly anecdote, and I'll pull in Nature's Bounty here. When I got to Nature's Bounty, one of the first edicts, I guess, I laid out was you cannot send an email about a supply chain problem. A business person can't send an email to a plant. A plant can't send an email to a supplier. But the issue with emails are, number one, they almost never contain enough information to do anything with. They're almost always an advocacy letter. Here's why I'm right and you're wrong type letter, even when they're very collaborative. But most of all, the issue with emails is it just keeps dumping the problem over a partition somewhere or over a wall. So the business person, commercial person sent the email, so the plant needs to fix it. So as we were talking about smoke signals, one of the things I think we learned at P&G and at Nature's Bounty was that a lot of times the smoke signals we're dealing with are fires. I mean, something has actually occurred and it's burning right now. And what are we going to do about it? And that's one of the reasons I don't like emails on supply chain issues, is because you can quickly get an email chain of 40 or 50 emails all stacked on top of each other with no solution in sight. So I'll go back to the reliability room. We used to call it the daily direction setting meeting for the supply chain, but it's the commercial community. It's everybody in the supply chain, from the suppliers' representatives to manufacturing to distribution centers to demand folks, etc., all on the phone together once a day, looking at the data, understanding where the fires are and what we're going to do about them. Now, this is not a continuous improvement meeting. This is not a what's the root cause and how are we going to go out and fix that. That's more of a weekly process or whatever cadence that you set up. But this daily process has got to be ensuring that when there is a fire or when there is a smoke signal, and I'll get to that in just a second because I have some ideas on that. But when there is a fire, here's what we are going to do about it. Not what manufacturing is going to do, not what the supplier is going to do. Here's what we are going to do about it. We, the end-to-end supply chain, from commercial to demand, from first moment of truth, second moment of truth back. Here's what our solution needs to be. And then the next day we can find out, did we solve it or did we not? What do we need to do? The other reason I don't like emails on these problems and like the collaboration is the point that was made earlier, and it's the bullwhip effect. If there's a fire at the supplier today, there's going to be a fire at the distribution center in a week or a month or at some point. So it's really getting the whole supply chain end to end engaged and coming up with an end-to-end solution, as opposed to praying somebody's going to answer one of these emails with a solution somewhere in this 50 email chain that's been flying around. The second thing on the smoke signals, and I think one of the things we learned was the value of, and I think everybody has spoken to this, it's interim measures. So it's easy to look at inventory. Is inventory at target, not at target? Was fill good yesterday or not good yesterday? But as far as trying to sense where you're going, having all these interim measures in place, and it can be supplier plan performance, it can be demand plan performance, it can be supply plan performance, knowing what you're expecting to occur each day reliably and predictably, and then understanding if one of these is going below whatever control limits or whatever limits you have set on that performance. So you might be just fine with supplier performance at 95% or at 90% because you've got all that leeway built in. But if it goes below 90%, you know you're going to have a problem. And so really taking these smoke signals by setting up all these key interim measures, and your operating strategy will decide what measures are critical for your supply chain. And letting your information technology, letting your system trigger you when one of these interim measures has gone either below a control limit or it's approaching a control limit or whatever it might be. The final thing I'll touch base on top of the people part, and it's just an example from when we deployed Oracle at Nature's Bounty. One of our key focus areas was we were not going to automate anything that we weren't currently doing. So Oracle is going to give us the opportunity to automate a lot of stuff that we weren't doing, so we started doing that stuff. but we did it before we got Oracle. So before we tried to automate anything, we ensured that the people were trained, they knew the work process, they were doing it manually, they understood who they needed to talk to, they understood how it connected. Then we came through and automated it later and gave them more visibility, more technology, more answers. But they already knew, for lack of a better term, sort of what's in the black box. What's in the black box is just what I was doing manually yesterday. It's just I'm allowed to do significantly more of it today because the black box is spurting out a lot of what I used to have to do in an Excel spreadsheet or whatever system you were using.
That's a great perspective, and I think as we approach the end of the webinar, I'm going to sum up a couple of key points and just ask anybody to comment. I mean, Professor Hau Lee, I love your perspective on hyper responsiveness. I mean, in the digital world, everything happens faster. We don't have to wait for emails and written responses and people to appear. There's a digital twin of the business that's operating in a real-time mode. And when fires start burning, they're going to burn fast. So if you're not hyper responsive, if you're not sensing and responding in hyper speeds, you're probably not going to catch the problem. So I hope I did justice to that point. If there's any small point you want to add to that, Professor.
Thanks. Also, I want to mention that my friends at P&G, it was P&G that taught me the Bullwhip Effect. It was Ralph Dreyer, a very, very early days leader of supply chain management at Procter Gamble, that told me about the bullwhip situation that he was faced with diapers, not toilet paper. And so I learned a lot about this distortion. And I think you're right, Roddy, that we must have good sensing, and the technology help us to speed things up and also collect more data, but still it requires us to make sense out of it. So what can we do to analyze it, to understand, is that just noise, or is it really truly what's happening? Or are we overreacting? Or is it just some anxiety, that panic that people did, and which may not truly represent the long-term picture? So sensing still is required. And
Fantastic.
In response, yeah, so thank you.
So Paul, smoke signals, right? I mean, that you've left your mark on this meeting with smoke signals. And I mean, there's nothing like a small smoke signal, a big fire, a small fire, to decide from a leadership point of view, is this something I really worry about? That's got to be a really key point at CIO level to drive change and understand how the business is operating.
No, without a doubt. And, I really liked how Paul Bittinger put it in terms of making sure you have that, where's the cliff, right? And making sure that you always set your measures prior to the cliff, because not every smoke signal is of the same importance, intensity. And if everybody chases fire X, the wind may blow it over and really make fire Y. And I think that's something actually we can improve on, just from that view of how do you actually really create that data history, that tolerance, and that learning from your history to influence how you define and respond to the smoke signals and the sensing.
Yeah, that's a fantastic perspective. And straight into you, Mike. I mean, understanding the process and getting to understand the risks, doing your homework on your capabilities before you madly react to fires. Exactly the point that Paul made. What would you add to that comment?
Yeah, I would say that, what we've talked about all goes very well together. The concept of setting those cliffs and the thresholds consistent with the measures that you've established and driving the continuous improvement, both the corrective action in a situation, but the preventive action that prevents that failure from ever happening again is absolutely critical. And the one thing that we didn't talk about too much that I'll throw in is it all has to start with powerful leadership. We talk a lot about people, process, and technology. I've learned throughout the course of my career that there's a fourth leg to that stool, and many times that's where it starts, is with powerful leadership.
Yeah, that's why it's such a privilege to have Paul on this call, because change happens top down. I remember when I was an analyst, we used to talk about projects owned by the CEO don't fail, right? There's a reason for that. When you're bottom up, then everybody's messing around with their own local priorities. When the CEO says jump, You ask how high, where do you want me to land, and you get it done. So that's a good perspective. And Paul, just to end off with you, P&G, that integration of people, process, and technology, I think is an absolute benchmark. And I think the point that Mike has just made, and certainly Paul made around leadership, and that is, I remember as an analyst taking ideas into P&G, and I would be asked, how does that help us with the first moment of truth? If it doesn't, thank you very much, we're not interested. So that governance from the leadership level of driving people, process, technology, leadership to focus on on-shelf availability, customer success, that's magic. And that certainly I stick P&G as an absolute best practice benchmark in that sense. Any comments you would add as we close off?
I'll just close off right where you're leading to, Roddy, and that is that there's only one arbiter of truth, and it can't be anybody in the room, in my opinion, because then you have advocates of the truth instead of an arbiter. So when you've selected, whether it's your patient, whether it's the first moment of truth, the second moment of truth, there's got to be something that determines, for example, what is successful agility and what's not successful agility. Just because a project was put in, if it didn't truly improve the lives of the consumers or the stockholders in some cases, then it was just busy work. So I'm with you, and somebody mentioned earlier SAMC, as a services measured by customer. And again, that's just a way of having that outside voice in the meeting saying, I am the one you're trying to solve for in this session.
That's fantastic. And, once again, I mean, we've been doing a lot of work around issues management. And I think, you all drive home a particularly relevant piece of issues management. If the issue is not causing smoke, if there's no fire, if the issue is not visible to the business to solve, if the issue is not an opportunity to bring people, process, and technology together to solve and make it go away and improve it forever, and Paul, if that issue is not visible in an extreme sense very quickly to top leadership, then you're going to get caught in the back foot and probably not deliver a critical, service delivery to a hospital of plasma, which, nobody wants to see. So we're on the top of the hour at the end of the webinar. I want to, just remind everybody who's going to listen to this, you have over 100 years of collective, very experienced supply chain leaders on this panel. And I want to personally thank every one of them for making the time to be on the panel. And I want to amplify Paul's perspective, and that is, let's not ever forget about everyone that's been on the front lines in the pandemic and say thank you to them, because everybody's made a lot of sacrifices under extremely difficult circumstances. And hopefully one day soon we see the back end of the pandemic, but we will live to a new normal. And all the things that we've said here today are the foundations for how we're going to deal with the next disruption, if and when it occurs. And that's likely to be sometime. So once again, thank you very, very much, all of you, for taking this time.